What would you do if the very people who were supposed to keep your neighborhood in order turned it into their personal kingdom? When I moved into Maplewood Estates, a picturesque suburban community just outside of Denver, I thought I had finally found the perfect place for some peace and quiet. The houses were charming, the streets were lined with old oak trees, and the neighborhood had that classic, small-town feel where people waved at each other from their front porches. It didn't take long for me to realize, though, that I hadn't just moved into a neighborhood, I had walked straight into a dictatorship. And at the center of it all was one man, Brad Whitman, HOA president, part-time tyrant, and full-time fraud. At first, I didn't think much of the Homeowners Association. I had heard the usual complaints about HOAs being overly strict, but I figured as long as I followed the basic rules, I wouldn't have any problems. That assumption was shattered the day I received my first fine, a $750 penalty for my newly installed smart doorbell. According to the HOA bylaws, security cameras were allowed as long as they met size regulations, but my model was apparently half an inch too big. That's right. Half an inch. When I tried to reason with Brad, showing him the manufacturer's specifications on my phone, he just smirked, adjusted his Apple Watch, and shrugged. Rules are rules, Mr. Reed. Maybe next time you should read the bylaws more carefully. That was my first real introduction to how things worked in Maplewood Estates. Brad didn't enforce rules to keep the community beautiful, he used them to line his own pockets and punish anyone who got in his way. He handed out fines like they were party favors, but when it came to his own property, the rules didn't apply. His backyard was a disaster zone of unpermitted modifications, from an illegal privacy fence to a collection of solar panels that violated multiple city codes. But the worst part? Brad was using the HOA as his personal ATM. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. The neighborhood's HOA fees were nearly double those of surrounding communities, yet the amenities were falling apart. The community gym had been under renovation for over a year, yet no actual work was being done. The so-called state-of-the-art security system that Brad had insisted was necessary for the neighborhood never worked, except, of course, at his house, where cameras had been installed at HOA expense. I wasn't the only one noticing these things. My neighbors grumbled about Brad's selective enforcement and outrageous fines, but no one wanted to speak up. Those who did found themselves mysteriously targeted, more fines, more violations, more headaches. One woman down the street, a single mother, got fined for letting her kids use sidewalk chalk outside her house. Another neighbor, an elderly veteran named Mr. Dawson, received a letter threatening foreclosure unless he repainted his house in an HOA-approved shade of beige within 30 days. Brad had built a system designed to keep himself in power, punish his critics, and milk the neighborhood for every dollar he could squeeze out of it. And yet, he still wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. That's when I realized, this wasn't just about enforcing petty rules. Brad was running a full-scale HOA scam. And if no one else was going to stop him, I would. But I wouldn't do it through angry emails or public confrontations. No, I had something else in mind. If Brad loved playing king, then I was about to become his inside man. I knew taking down Brad Whitman wouldn't be easy. He had spent years entrenching himself in the HOA, surrounding himself with allies who benefited from his schemes while intimidating anyone who questioned him. If I wanted to expose him, I needed to get on the inside, learn exactly how he operated, and gather undeniable proof of his corruption. So I played the long game. I volunteered for the HOA board under the pretense of being a tech-savvy, eager homeowner who wanted to help modernize our community. Brad welcomed me with open arms, seeing me as nothing more than a useful pawn who could handle the HOA's digital transformation initiatives while leaving him free to continue his shady dealings. For the next 18 months, I kept my head down, playing the part of the politically naive newcomer while quietly taking notes on everything Brad did. I watched how he manipulated board meetings, burying important votes in endless technical jargon that confused the less tech-savvy members. He scheduled critical decisions during holiday weekends, ensuring only his allies could attend. Complaints from residents about unfair fines and mismanagement mysteriously vanished from email records. If someone persisted, Brad would sigh dramatically during meetings and claim, "Sorry, we've been having server issues again." You know how unreliable technology can be. The first major red flag came when I requested access to the HOA's financial records. I framed it as wanting to help optimize our budget, maybe even find ways to lower fees. Brad laughed it off, waving a dismissive hand. "All in the cloud, safe and secure," he said, offering no actual access. That was when I knew I had to start digging deeper. I began talking to other homeowners, learning just how outrageous our fees were compared to nearby communities. Maplewood Estates had some of the highest HOA dues in the county, yet our amenities were falling apart. The gym had been under renovation for over a year with no visible improvements. The security system Brad claimed was necessary for our safety had never functioned, except for the cameras installed on his house. I started keeping track of every unexplained expense, every time Brad waved off a financial question, every project that somehow remained in progress, while the funds allocated for it mysteriously disappeared. Then came the breakthrough. When I finally obtained access to partial financial records, I discovered they were an absolute mess, a labyrinth of mislabeled files, missing invoices, and vague descriptions that meant nothing. A $225,000 charge labeled Smart Home Integration Consulting had been paid to a company that, upon closer inspection, didn't even exist. Thousands of dollars were allocated for cybersecurity upgrades, yet there was no documentation proving the work had ever been done. That's when I called in reinforcements. I reached out to Melissa Mel Carter, a CPA and one of the few homeowners who had been openly skeptical of Brad from the start. Together, we began unraveling the financial chaos Brad had created to cover his tracks. We traced HOA transactions against public business records and discovered that Brad had been routing funds through a series of shell companies, eventually funneling money into cryptocurrency wallets registered in his name. Even worse, he wasn't just inflating upgrade costs, he was working with a partner. His college roommate, an IT consultant, was supposedly handling our community-wide smart security initiatives. In reality, he was receiving HOA funds for work that didn't exist, then kicking a portion of that money back to Brad. It was a classic wash-rinse-repeat fraud scheme, dressed up with tech jargon to fool homeowners who didn't know any better. I felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just corruption, it was outright theft. And Brad wasn't content with just bleeding homeowners dry, he was systematically targeting and pressuring anyone who opposed him into selling their homes. As Mel and I pieced together more evidence, a terrifying pattern emerged. Multiple families had been forced to sell their homes over the last 3 years due to Brad's tactics. He used a combination of excessive fines, legal threats, and harassment to financially strangle residents until they had no choice but to leave. Then, a local real estate agent, one of Brad's close friends, would conveniently swoop in to buy the foreclosed homes at below-market prices. They'd flip them, sell them to new residents who had no idea about the HOA's corruption, and Brad would repeat the cycle. I wasn't just dealing with a crooked HOA president anymore. Brad had built an entire empire of fraud, theft, and intimidation, and it had gone unchecked for years. But he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated me. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became, Brad Whitman wasn't just corrupt. He was dangerous. And like all frauds who have been getting away with it for too long, he was getting reckless. The moment he sensed that homeowners were growing restless, he escalated his tactics, turning the HOA into a full-blown operation of control, harassment, and suppression. It started with fines and violation notices that became more frequent and absurd. I wasn't the only one targeted anymore. Homeowners who had never received so much as a warning before suddenly found themselves flooded with notices. A retired teacher down the street was fined for having a flagpole that was half a foot too tall. A family with 2 toddlers received a violation for their driveway chalk drawings, labeled as defacement of community property. But one case stood out more than the rest. Mr. Dawson, a retired veteran who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, was threatened with foreclosure. His crime? The paint on his house wasn't an approved shade of beige. Brad issued him a warning, then a fine, then a formal notice stating that the HOA was placing a lien on his property unless he repainted within 30 days. The catch? Brad had conveniently delayed the approval process for repainting permits, ensuring Mr. Dawson couldn't comply even if he wanted to. It was legal entrapment, designed to force a sale. That's when I realized that the forced evictions weren't a side hustle, they were part of Brad's main operation. As I quietly worked to gather evidence, Brad began ramping up his next power move, fabricating a community security crisis. He announced in a board meeting that there had been a sharp rise in break-ins and cyber threats affecting our neighborhood. No one could confirm this because, conveniently, the community security cameras had not been functioning for months, except, of course, the ones on Brad's property. He claimed we needed an emergency cybersecurity upgrade to protect homeowners, justifying a $100,000 expense, money that would, of course, be routed through his shell companies. But the real shock came when I learned just how far Brad was willing to go to silence me. One morning, I received a formal letter from an HOA-affiliated lawyer. The letter accused me of spreading false claims about the HOA and engaging in defamation. It included a cease and desist order, warning me that further attempts to undermine HOA authority could result in legal action. I wasn't the only one. Several homeowners I had been working with suddenly received anonymous complaints to their workplaces. A neighbor who had attended a private meeting with me was reported to their boss for inappropriate workplace behavior, an accusation so vague and obviously false that HR immediately dismissed it. But the message was clear: Brad was willing to go after people's livelihoods to protect himself. Then came the ultimate attempted cover-up. One night, I tried accessing the HOA's official website, where homeowners could review financial records and submit requests. The entire site was down. A message appeared on the homepage: maintenance in progress. We apologize for the inconvenience. This maintenance lasted for weeks. Homeowners who requested financial records were told that technical issues were preventing access. The digital walls were closing in. Brad was scrambling to hide his tracks. But his desperation made him sloppy. Brad made a critical mistake when he pushed through a new HOA rule stating that all community-wide documents, announcements, and financial reports must be distributed exclusively through HOA-approved channels. This meant homeowners could no longer email each other about HOA concerns, post flyers, or even discuss community issues in online groups. All information had to be funneled through Brad's system, where he controlled what was shared and what conveniently disappeared. It was the final straw. He had gone from stealing money to silencing residents and now weaponizing HOA regulations against the very people funding his scheme. I knew I had to act fast. I had gathered enough evidence to prove fraud, but exposing Brad wasn't just about showing numbers on a spreadsheet. I had to take him down in a way that left no room for escape. If Brad wanted total control of the HOA, then I was about to turn that power against him. Brad Whitman had spent years ruling Maplewood Estates like his personal kingdom, convinced that his web of lies, intimidation, and legal manipulation would keep him untouchable. But every corrupt leader eventually makes a fatal mistake: they push too far. And Brad had pushed the wrong person. I wasn't just going to expose him, I was going to make sure he could never pull a stunt like this again. With my growing network of frustrated homeowners, I carefully orchestrated the perfect ambush. The annual HOA meeting was coming up, and typically, only a handful of people bothered to attend. Not this time. Using a private WhatsApp group, I leaked just enough evidence to spark outrage: financial inconsistencies, proof of manipulated fines, and the lien scheme that nearly cost Mr. Dawson his home. I didn't share everything yet. If I wanted Brad to fully unravel, I needed him to think he was still in control until the last moment. The night of the meeting, the virtual Zoom call was packed. Normally, these meetings were quiet, with Brad dictating the agenda, brushing off concerns, and wrapping up quickly to avoid too many questions. But this time, every homeowner who had been cheated, fined, or harassed showed up. Brad, always confident, began the meeting as usual. He smoothed his shirt, adjusted his tie, and flashed his politician's smile. It's been a challenging year, but thanks to my leadership. That's when I interrupted. About that leadership, Brad. Can you explain these financial discrepancies? I shared my screen. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in misallocated funds appeared before the entire community. Shell companies, fake invoices, payments to non-existent contractors. Every transaction traced back to him. Brad froze. His expression twitched, but he recovered quickly. This isn't the appropriate forum for these kinds of baseless accusations. I'll be happy to discuss this privately. Oh, we're discussing it now, Brad, I shot back. And I'm recording this meeting, just in case you try to lose it later. The chat exploded. Homeowners unmuted themselves, demanding answers. Brad tried to shut down the meeting, but I had already been designated as co-host. He clicked frantically, realizing he had lost control. Then, in a desperate move, he dropped his final bombshell. Due to recent community concerns, I am invoking a bylaw revision. Effective immediately, removing an HOA president now requires a 2/3 majority vote instead of a simple majority. Homeowners gasped. He had changed the rules, mid-meeting, to save himself. But Brad had failed to cover one crucial detail. That's funny, Brad, I said, pulling up a timestamped screenshot of the bylaws from just last week. Because according to this, no such change was ever discussed or approved. Which means you just attempted to illegally alter HOA regulations. And that, my friend, is fraud. Brad's face turned red. His mouth opened and closed as he realized the walls were caving in. Homeowners weren't just angry anymore. They were furious. The vote to remove him wasn't just a majority, it was nearly unanimous. And as Brad tried to protest, claiming legal action and misunderstandings, I dropped the final bombshell. Oh, by the way, Brad, I took the liberty of forwarding all of this to the HOA's legal counsel. And the County Fraud Division. And the FBI. Silence. Brad logged off. The HOA meeting ended, but his nightmare had just begun. Brad Whitman had spent years manipulating the system, bending rules in his favor, and lining his pockets with stolen HOA funds. But in the end, the truth buried him. After his humiliating removal, the HOA board immediately launched a forensic audit, and the results were even worse than I had imagined. Over $75,000 in embezzled funds, another $200,000 mismanaged, and clear evidence of wire fraud. The case was handed over to law enforcement, and within weeks, the FBI stepped in. Brad tried to play the victim, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the paper trail didn't lie. His fraudulent invoices, hidden transactions, and direct deposits into his personal accounts sealed his fate. His college roommate, the so-called IT consultant who had been receiving HOA money for non-existent cybersecurity work, was also charged. Facing federal fraud charges, both of them were forced to liquidate assets to pay back the money they had stolen. But that wasn't enough. The HOA filed a civil lawsuit to recover every last cent, and with no way out, Brad had to sell his home. Watching his once pristine, illegally modified house sit on the market, dropping in price month after month, was poetic justice. When it finally sold, it went to a tech-savvy family who actually understood digital security. The irony was almost too perfect. Meanwhile, the neighborhood finally recovered from the mess Brad had left behind. The community gym was fully restored, the security system was replaced, this time, actually working, and HOA fees dropped significantly. We implemented a fully transparent financial system where every homeowner could see exactly where their money was going in real time. No more hidden budgets, no more surprise renovation costs. As I walked past Brad's old house one evening, Mel joked, "Remember when he said he needed $10,000 for AI-powered landscaping robots?" We both laughed, knowing that Brad's legacy was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. The HOA forums online had turned him into a viral example of corruption gone wrong. He even tried to join another HOA in a different state, but one Google search was enough to get him blacklisted from ever holding power again. Justice wasn't just served, it was backed up in triplicate and shared with everyone who needed to see it. But the real question is, how many more Brads are out there, running their HOAs like their own personal empires? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.